With a crackle, branch lightning lit up the early winter night with a silvery white flash. It didn't smite the ground, but instead, it tore through the air, illuminating the spot where Klein stood, as if it was daytime, making him stand out. Spellsinger of God, Ace Snake, retracted his gaze, his face was gloomy as he whispered, Rose School of Thought. It's not a wraith, nor is it an undead creature. The mature middle-aged man with a pair of golden eyes turned his head to the side to look at Capheim's corpse and said, covering the target's corpse with tarot cards. This is the second time something like this has happened in the past 2 months. When was the first instance? Cardinal Snake asked in a deep voice. The mature middle-aged man in the well-ironed formal suit coughed lightly and said, the time when the true creator attempted to descend into this world with the help of a swindler. Then it's not the Rose School of Thought. Cardinal Snake made a definite judgment. Although those organizations that worshipped evil gods weren't fond of anyone, they wouldn't deliberately foil the plans of their counterparts. Instead, they wished to see their counterparts succeed, waiting for them to make a mess of the situation. I think so too. Perhaps it's the appearance of a new secret organization. The characteristic feature is to scatter tarot cards all over the target's body. The middle-aged man smiled. And the different appearance of the tarot cards imply different meanings. This corpse has 2 cards over his face. One is Judgment, and the other is the Emperor. Judgment is the motive and goal, while the Emperor is the organization's code name. Of course, this might also be a type of ritual. Cardinal Snake didn't respond as he surveyed the area. Let's see what exactly happened here. It was only at this point in time that the first batch of mandated punishers arrived at Capheim's villa. Above the grey fog, having only used paper figurine substitutes thrice and not being pushed to his limits, Klein was about to use divination to confirm Daisy's safety afterward. Daisy will successfully return home. Holding the spirit pendulum in his left hand, he closed his eyes and silently chanted the sentence. After repeating it 7 times, Klein opened his eyes and saw the topaz pendant turning counterclockwise, but it moved with a very slow frequency and a tiny amplitude. This means that Daisy's journey home will be quite a bumpy one, but almost negligible. After interpreting the revelation, Klein was relieved of his final concerns. He then looked at the 2 items in front of him, both of which were radiating with a strong spiritual luster. One of them was a light blue, translucent hexagonal pillar. There were traces of light flashing through it, as though it was lightning that came from the depths of one's consciousness. This was the beyond characteristic left behind by Mam Catty. The other belonged to Parker, who hadn't been able to play a role in the battle. His beyond characteristic had condensed into a ball, like a child's fist. This fist was made up of 3 colors, iron black and dark red colors intertwined with a large swath of silver. Klein didn't hesitate to conjure a pen and paper. He was ready to use these 2 beyond characteristics to divine the corresponding potion formulas. Before he advanced to sequence 7, because of the additional influences that had been left on the beyond characteristics he had, it was almost impossible to use divination to determine the formulas. Even if this mysterious space could help him eliminate the interference and increase his divination ability to a certain extent, it still wasn't enough. Therefore, the only method Klein could use, in the past, was mediumship. After he became a magician, he was preliminarily able to determine that using the beyond characteristic for a divination above the grey fog. However, there was a high probability of him failing. This time, without exception, Klein had shamelessly failed. However, he also had some gains, and that was to be able to find out the corresponding sequence names of the 2 beyond characteristics. Parker is a sequence 8 sheriff and Catty is a sequence 7 interrogator. Aren't these from the Arbiter pathway? This pathway is controlled by the royal family, the military, and a small number of ancient aristocratic families in Lowen. Any recent formulas and beyonder ingredients are dealt with harshly. Could a number of the girls abducted by Capheim be sent to the estate of some aristocrat? But there's no need for them to send 4 beyonders to help Capheim just to enjoy themselves. It obviously doesn't make sense. Harris is much more powerful than Catty, so perhaps he's a sequence 6 of this pathway. After wearing that glove, he might even be as strong as a sequence 5. Could it be that they're involved in some bloody heretic sacrifice, and the target they seek cannot be exposed? Apart from those on the inside of the kingdom, Finapotter's Castilla family also possesses this beyond a pathway, which is then transmitted to their army and intelligence system. Could this be another espionage case of some unknown nature? Klein tried to divine a few of his conjectures, but he failed again. He temporarily put this matter to the back of his mind and lightly tapped the edge of the long bronze table as he muttered to himself, as long as I have the formula with the corresponding supplementary ingredients, these 2 beyond characteristics will be able to turn a person into a sequence 8 sheriff and sequence 7 interrogator. Miss Magician's friend who's called Xio seems to be lacking the beyonder. Ingredients for sheriff. I can sell Parker's beyond characteristic to Miss Magician through the world so that I can quickly amass the money needed for the ingredients of the faceless sequence potion. However, always doing it through the world doesn't seem rather appropriate. I deliberately left the tarot cards this time. If Miss Justice were to hear of this matter, then she would definitely believe that it was done by my door, or I'll let Mr. Fool do the selling on his behalf. Klein quickly finalized a plan and made the sheriff and interrogator beyond the characteristics fly to the corner and hid it among the junk pile. I wonder what the names are for the Arbiter pathway sequence 6 and 5. It seems like something that uses order and laws judge. Klein put away those thoughts and closed his eyes midway to carefully observe his current state. Once again, he felt his spirituality become lively as the potion stirred. He felt that his digestion of the potion had sped up. This time, he had confidence, based on his intuition, that he had concluded most of the magician rules. The remaining minutiae were good to have, but it didn't really matter if he lacked them. It didn't significantly affect his digestion process. Conjuring a fountain pen and goatskin, Klein enhanced his memory by writing the magician's rules. 1. Never perform unprepared. challenge the impossible, even if the final outcome is nothing but an illusion. Klein believed that these were the two core tenets of the magician's rules. Grasping them would be key, and the rest were supplementary for perfection. 3. Take the initiative to perform. 4. Try to get applause from the audience. 5. Wield control of the target's attention. Putting down the dark red fountain pen, Klein skimmed through it and judged them by himself. Daily acting, together with 3 or 4 proactive acting instances, would be enough to allow me to digest the magician potion before New Year's. If I were to challenge an impossible performance during this period, then my progress would be even faster. This is roughly at the speed I wish to achieve. There were still about 2 months till the 1st of January 1350. After doing all this, Klein rubbed his temples, prepared to return to the real world. After putting away the Dark Emperor card, the biological poison bottle, and other items, he suddenly laughed and said self-deprecatingly, "Challenge the impossible, isn't that equivalent to courting death?" As his voice echoed, Klein's figure disappeared from the space above the grey fog. In the cheap hotel in the Backland Bridge area, he suddenly opened his eyes and saw the candlelight of his summoning ritual. After quickly clearing up everything, Klein put on a thick worker's jacket he'd bought for 4 solly and went to the window. He picked up the sweet iced tea that he had bought earlier and looked at his blurry figure which was reflected in the window. There was a heartfelt smile on his face as he whispered, "Cheers." Just as he finished his sentence, he touched the glass with his cup, then lifted his chin and downed it in one gulp. Then, he sauntered out of the hotel. The nearby gas lamps were already fully lit up, and pedestrians and carts were bustling about, oblivious to the explosion at the border between the Chilwood Borough and West Borough. Klein strolled around the Bravehearts bar for a while, and at 7:58, he knocked on the door of the Beyond, a gathering organized by Eye of Wisdom. He wore an iron mask and a hooded robe, acting completely ordinary. Meanwhile, Xio, who went to various places every night to check on her contacts, saw a sign that had never appeared before. It belonged to the golden masked man who had sold the sheriff's formula to her at the gathering organized by Mr. A. It was the sign of an emergency meeting. "He hasn't come looking for me all this time, and I've been pretending that had never happened." Why would he suddenly? Xio thought for a moment before deciding to take a look. The golden masked man had promised to give her some missions, allowing her to save enough money and exchange it for the corresponding Beyonder ingredients. Therefore, Xio switched areas and marked the time and place of the meeting. Half an hour later, Xio walked out of her hiding place after secretly observing a remote alley that also extended in all directions. She walked towards the golden masked man. The man was still wearing his black tuxedo. His light brown eyes swept over Xio's head. "There's a mission for you." "Difficulty and compensation?" Xio asked like clockwork. The man nudged his mask, which was forged from gold. "It's not dangerous, but it can be very dangerous. It all depends on what you do. The initial compensation is £30. If you can acquire useful information, I can even directly give you a Beyonder ingredient corresponding to Sheriff." "What's the mission?" Xio said with a frown. The golden masked man's gaze turned heavy as he said, "Through the channels available to you, figure out who has recently been keeping tabs on Capheim." "Capheim? That human trafficker?" Xio returned with a question. The man nodded. "Yes." "I reject this mission. I hate him." Xio immediately refused. The man opposite her chuckled. "You aren't working for Capheim?" "Because he's dead." "Dead?" Xio was instantly stunned. He died at home, and his body was covered with tarot cards. There were 2 cards on his face, one Judgment, and the other the Emperor. By the way, pay attention to matters in the past few years which have involved tarot cards but were not reported to the police, the man added. Chilwood Borough, in the house Xio and Force rented. Force was just finishing the beginning of her new book and, in her good mood, prepared to reward herself with a cigarette when Xio pushed open the door and entered the study. "Smoking is harmful to your health," Xio sniffed. Force didn't argue with her when she saw her puzzled look. Instead, she asked, "Looks like something happened to you?" Xio scratched her rough blonde hair and sat down on a nearby chair. "That person from before contacted me, the person who sold the sheriff formula to me through another person at Mr. A's gathering. He gave me a relatively simple mission. The initial reward is £30. I don't even know if there are any hidden dangers." Force thought for a moment and then said, "The person, there should be an organization behind him, but why would they want to rope you in? Aren't they afraid of being implicated by your intelligence, thus causing the entire organization to be completely destroyed? There's nothing they really need from you either. Your looks are barely passable, but you're too short, so perhaps your life is relatively more valuable, eh? What mission is it?" Xio was used to her good friend snide remarks as she ignored what she said in the beginning. She directly answered the second question, "Investigate if there has been anyone keeping tabs on Capheim recently." "Capheim? The human trafficker who deserves to be hanged? No, burned to death. Although Force wasn't a bounty hunter, it was her writer's instinct to gather material. So she often asked Xio to tell her stories and news she had learned." Xio nodded. "It's him, but he's already dead. He seems to have died rather miserably." "How did he die? Was he sliced to death by a knife, bit by bit?" Force asked, pleased and curious. "That person didn't go into a detailed description. Perhaps it'll be mentioned in the papers tomorrow." Xio thought for 2 seconds before continuing. He only mentioned a rather special situation at the scene of the death. He said that Capheim's corpse was covered in tarot cards. His face was covered with the Judgment and the Emperor cards. The Judgment card probably meant that it was a judgment on Capheim, and the verdict was death. But what does the Emperor card represent? That murderer, no, that hero's identity. As a best-selling author, Force instinctively began interpreting the unique layout of the scene of the crime. Suddenly, she froze. Tarot cards? The corpse was strewn with tarot cards. Force suddenly thought of the secret organization she had just joined, Tarot Club. It couldn't be one of us, could it? However, none of the members has the code name of the Emperor if it's really the case. Then this is the first time I've found traces of the Tarot Club in the real world. We're not just a secret organization that only exists above the grey fog. As Force's emotions churned, she felt pleasantly surprised and also worried. Under an attendant's lead, Klein entered the familiar activity room. There was only one candle in the room. The dim yellow light made the surroundings look like a scene from a ghost story. Coupled with the black robes and the iron masks worn by the mysterious people, the atmosphere turned even more intense. The moment he stepped in, Klein suddenly had a baffling sensation. He felt the flickering candle flame staring at him. He felt that the flame would burst and ignite his hair and robe. He felt that the curtain behind the oriel window would suddenly flare up, enveloping his body and covering his nose and mouth, forcefully choking him to death. What's happening? Klein was stunned as he turned extremely tense. It wasn't a premonition for danger, but a feeling that was hard to avoid. Klein carefully found a seat and sat down. The moment his buttocks touched the surface of the chair, he felt as if the chair would explode and thick wooden thorns would end up piercing through his body. This reminded him of the videos he had seen back on Earth, due to the explosion of a low-quality gas cylinder under a swivel chair, the steel pole. And the debris had stabbed into the seated owner's buttocks, drilling into his abdomen. The whole scene was filled with badly mutilated blood and flesh, a ghastly sight. Why am I always making such bad associations? Is it because of the damage done to my spirit body from the battle earlier? Klein looked around thoughtfully and saw that the fat apothecary had still not offended. What happened, or has he already left Backland? Klein murmured something to himself and heard Eye of Wisdom announce the beginning of the gathering. In the course of the next few hours, Klein felt as if the chandelier on the ceiling was going to fall sideways and smash into his head. He thought that the coffee table in front of Eye of Wisdom would suddenly move sideways and stumble him over. And he suspected that the members of the gathering around him were full of malice and might cause him trouble at any moment. It made him fidgety, alert, and puzzled, and he was too distracted to pay attention to deals that either ended in success or failure. If one is to say that a premonition for danger is like an occasional vibration, reminding one that there's news entering the room or an incoming phone call, then the feeling I have at this moment is akin to an electric drill boring constantly, causing me to be unable to relax or pay attention to anything else. Klein tried to rub his forehead, but it only touched the cold iron mask. At this moment, he felt as if his iron mask would suddenly cave in and stick close to his face, embedding itself into his brain. Is it really because my spirit body was damaged so it's making me hallucinate? Klein frowned. He originally wanted to make a request to buy the thousand-faced hunter's blood and mutated pituitary gland at this meeting, but in such a situation, he could only give up out of caution. Although the level of Eye of Wisdom's gathering wasn't high, and there was a high probability that it wouldn't involve a high-level monster like the thousand-faced hunter, Klein believed that a lot of the members here also attended other gatherings and might be able to come into contact with the relevant information and clues. Amidst his anxiety, Klein attended the gathering as a bystander. Just after taking off his robe, removing his mask, and leaving the room, the feeling that everything in the room was going to harm him had instantly disappeared, disappearing in the oddest manner. This Klein's pupils shrank, confirming that his previous experiences didn't originate from the damage to his spirit body. Otherwise, he wouldn't have experienced two completely different states, inside and outside. He suspected that there was a person or creature in the activity room of the gathering, one that was invisible, imperceptible, and extremely terrifying. That entity had stimulated his spiritual perception as a seer and his sense of danger as a clown, but because of the entity's suppression or some other special reason, this stimulus appeared in the form of a rich association that failed to make him realize it. Who could it be? This is too scary. Just the existence itself made me have a reaction similar to the symptoms of losing control without making a sound. Klein left Eye of Wisdom's house and headed toward the nearest street. All of a sudden, he had a guess. The Bravehearts bar is nearby, and it's also the monitoring area of Brave Steve, who was killed by Miss Sharon, Marek, and I. Their deaths would definitely make the Rose School of Thought's high sequence Beyonder angry, and he would cast his sights over here, towards the Beyonders living near the Bravehearts bar. Was that him? Fortunately, I used the biological poison bottle of the sun brooch tonight, and to prevent myself from being divined, I left them above the grey fog. Otherwise, the result would be unimaginable. The magician who just completed an impossible performance will be killed directly here. The Beyond world is truly dangerous. Inside the Holy Wind Cathedral, Cardinal Ace Snake looked at the captain of the mandated Punisher team and asked emotionlessly, "Who's Capheim? Why is there an underground dungeon in his villa?" The captain of the mandated Punisher team replied immediately, "He's a tycoon, one who was rumored to be related to many cases of missing girls. He's suspected of being a human trafficker, and that he is secretly engaged in the slave trade. The underground dungeon proves the rumors. Why did a human trafficker receive the protection of so many Beyonders? And their sequence isn't low either." Cardinal Snake pressed. "Your Grace, this requires an investigation." "We tried using Beyonder means to find clues, but all of them failed," the captain of the mandated Punisher team replied, somewhat trembling in fear. "I tried it too." Cardinal Snake didn't blame him. This member of the Church of the Lord of Storms as upper echelon paused for a moment before continue to investigate this matter. "Also, find that sequence 6 or 5 Spectre." After his subordinate had left, Cardinal Snake picked up his fountain pen and wrote down in his notebook a number of subjects to pay close attention to. Capheim, human trafficking, tarot card ritual, strange spectre without a high sequence, concealed plot. In Empress Borough, the opulent villa of Count Hall. Audrey was waiting for the maid to cut up the food, when she heard her father, Count Hall, who was used to reading the newspapers at breakfast, laugh. "Capheim is dead. Who is he?" Audrey asked with her eyes wide open. In fact, she wasn't the least bit curious about who Capheim was. She was simply going along with her father, who obviously had the desire to share his thoughts. This was both her specialty as a daughter and the innate nature of a telepathist. He's a tycoon who secretly might be a human trafficker. He has rather good ties with some people. Hey, Count Hall chuckled. He was killed last night. There were obvious signs of him being judged at the scene of the crime, so the newspapers are calling the murderer a hero bandit. The hero bandit Dark Emperor. Oh, they named him after the code name of the rulers of the ancient Solomon Empire. Hero bandit Dark Emperor. Dark Emperor Audrey immediately thought of the card of blasphemy belonging to Mr. Fool. This was the item of the highest level she had come into contact with so far. She suddenly became interested in the Capine murder. It sounds interesting. Although it's illegal, I still want to say that the hero bandit did beautifully. Oh, Dad, how did it go? The police and relevant departments of the church didn't divulge any exact details. I haven't met them either, but this is what's said on the papers. The hero bandit was dressed in black armor and a black crown. He had a cape of the same color behind him. After he entered Capine's villa, not only did he steal all the valuables in the safe, but he even stole the lives of Capine and his evil henchmen, rescuing girls who were locked up in the underground dungeon. He scattered tarot cards on Capine's body, and the most prominent of all were the two cards that covered his face. One of them was Judgment, and the other was the Emperor. Count Hall held the newspaper as he described it with a smile. Tarot cards, Judgment card and the Emperor card. Audrey's eyes suddenly lit up. Audrey could almost be certain that it had been done by Mr. Fool's Adora when she heard the description of the familiar scene. She suddenly felt a strong sense of immersion, participation, and pride. That was a human trafficker whose hands were stained with blood, and evil. The Judgment card is the retribution enacted against him in the name of justice. Was the verdict hanging, beheading, or burning at the stake? The Emperor should be a symbol of his identity. Was this the Adora who sneaked into the Royal Museum and stole the Dark Emperor card? Audrey let her imagination run wild for a moment. She had intended to press for more information and finer details, but from the look on her father's face, the tone of his voice, and the color of his emotions, she could tell that he still didn't know what was going on. Therefore, she could only suppress her curiosity and planned on asking her good friend, Kent Lear Sen, from MI9. Although directly asking Kent about it would suit my image in this aspect, that would still be rather abrupt. It would also conflict with my identity as a noble, whom I'll get Annie to prepare a few invitations for an afternoon tea party, sending them separately to Glaint, Kent, Murray, Christine, Jane, and the others. Most of them are interested in mysticism, so they would feel interested in someone known as the hero bandit Dark Emperor. Under my guidance, they can help me ask a lot of questions that wouldn't be convenient for me to ask. It's decided. Audrey retracted her attention and nibbled at her breakfast. She believed that Mr. Fool's Adoras wouldn't have dealt with Capine purely for the sake of punishing evil, since it wasn't in line with his identity and status. Of course, if Audrey was still the same Audrey who had just joined the Tarot Club a few months ago, then she definitely would have been willing to accept such an explanation. Otherwise, she wouldn't have chosen the Justice card as her symbol. After experiencing so many gatherings and so many matters, she felt that she had matured a lot and was no longer as innocent. She believed that there had to be more important and essential factors behind this matter, such as an evil god or secret organization which Capine was involved in. I hope Kent can provide some useful information, Audrey thought with anticipation. 15 Minsk Street. Klein was eating white bread with jam and flipping through today's newspapers. What? A safe? As he read, he almost choked on his own saliva. It wasn't me. I didn't. Don't spout nonsense. In his mind, Klein immediately rejected the description of his theft of everything in the safe thrice. The situation had been pressing, and in order to gain clues, all he did was burrow into the safe to see if there were any important documents or evidence despite having found the safe. He didn't take anything, and he quickly left the safe and went to another room. Of course, Klein, in his spirit-body state, had also suffered some damage from the gas explosion, and the total weight of the items he could carry had been greatly reduced. There were only gold bars, jewelry, land deeds, house deeds, and teats, and other items in the safe, which were either not convenient for him to take, or there was no way he could launder them. Perhaps he has a place reserved especially for cash, but unfortunately, I didn't find it, nor did I have the time to look for it. Klein muttered silently to himself, confirming that it was the subsequent investigators who had divided up all the contents in the safe. He looked at the newspaper, took a sip of side black tea, and slowly exhaled. He smiled inwardly. Hero Bandit Dark Emperor, I like that name. After breakfast, Klein put on his thick double-breasted frock coat and half-top hat, and he held a solid black cane. Opening the door, he left Minsk Street for Broken Axe Lane on the boundary of the East Borough. That was where Daisy had disappeared. After finalizing his plans yesterday, and before he committed to his operation, he had deliberately made a trip to Broken Axe Lane to seriously look for clues. He knocked on the doors of the nearby houses and asked if they had seen any girls like Daisy. Although Klein didn't believe that the official Beyonders would think that a poor family would be able to afford a hero bandit who had at least the strength of a Sequence 6. And he believed that there was a higher probability that the investigation would be directed towards the secrets Capine was involved in, supplemented by who had been keeping tabs on Capine recently, and other peripheral investigations. He still cautiously decided to put on a show and try his best to play out the entire act. What if one of the Beyonder enforcers lost their mind and planned to make a preliminary investigation in this aspect? Some families might have some savings and would be able to hire other detectives. The chances of being suspected as a kind-hearted person like me who just took on the case yesterday are extremely low. As long as I'm not suspected, they wouldn't compare my performance from the previous Lanivas case. Besides, the talks were the ones who took action previously and were assisted by the military special department. Capine's case happened in Sherwood Borough, so the ones taking on the case would likely be the mandated punishers. The communication between the two groups wouldn't be that smooth. Cathy and Parker belonged to the Arbiter pathway. I wonder if the military will intervene as a former network. Klein had a sufficient understanding of the modus operandi of the various official organizations, their work styles, and their investigation habits. Simply put, I have excellent anti-detective abilities. Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh as he boarded a carriage. He was going to continue his investigation into Daisy's disappearance. After all, he was an ordinary private detective who hadn't been able to confirm that Daisy's disappearance had anything to do with Capheim. At 9 o'clock in the morning, Daisy returned to the shabby rented apartment under the escort of the police officer in charge of the neighborhood. Along with a few pitiful girls like her, she had been settled into the various cathedrals in Sherwood Borough last night and had been questioned accordingly. It included what they saw when they escaped, what they saw when they looked back, where they lived, what their family situation was, if they knew any friends who were out of the ordinary, and so on and so forth. Daisy, who was still in a state of panic and lingering fear, answered the questions truthfully. After that, no one came to her again. She slept through the night and was sent back to East Borough early in the morning, where she was handed over to the fierce police officer she always saw. Along the way, Daisy didn't dare to say anything. She trembled in fear, and only when she entered the apartment where she lived did she feel a little more at ease. As soon as she stepped through the door, and before she could find her mother and sister through the hanging wet clothes, she heard a scream. Daisy. Frasier stopped whatever she was doing and, like a nimble fawn, darted through the clothes hanging in the air and the random things on the ground. She ran to the door and hugged her sister tightly. Then she let go of her hand, and with tears streaming down her cheeks, she sized Daisy up with pleasant surprise and unconcern. Are you all right? It's so wonderful that you're finally back. Liv also stood up from behind the wash basin. She wiped her hands on her clothes and asked, rubbing her eyes, Daisy, where have you been these past few days? At that moment, the police officer interrupted. She was kidnapped. We rescued her. Thank you. You guys are too great. Liv shed tears and randomly used an adjective. The policeman coughed lightly and said, That's our duty. Have you met anyone strange in the past few days? Liv was stunned for a second, hoping to not be involved in too many matters or get into any trouble. She said, No, I really haven't. The policeman waved his hand and said, Be more careful in the future. Don't take deserted shortcuts again. He couldn't stand the humidity and the motley of smells, so he turned and left. Liv looked at her daughter again. She took wide strides over to her side and wiped her hands on the side of her clothes before hugging Daisy. It's good that you're back. It's good that you're back, she murmured through her tears, not asking if Daisy had been hurt. Daisy relaxed and sobbed. Beside her, Frasier was also crying. She stretched out her arms and hugged her mother and sister respectively. The three of them cried for a while before letting go. Liv wiped her eyes again and said, Wash the clothes first. There are still a lot of them. Daisy, who had just been rescued, nodded and quickly threw herself into her busy work. It wasn't until noon, while they were nibbling on their black bread and drinking plain water that could hardly even be considered tea, that Liv finally had time to ask, Daisy, were you hurt? Daisy shook her head. They just hit me a few times. That's great. The police rescued you. A kind detective was willing to help search for you for free yesterday, and you ended up returning today. Ah, he still has your vocabulary book, Frasier mentioned in passing. Already prepared, Liv mentioned, I'll get old Gola to get it back and tell the detective you're home so that he won't have to busy himself over this matter. Regardless, we have to thank him again. Daisy felt relieved as she replied to her sister's question. No, it wasn't the police. There was a sudden explosion, and the doors that kept us locked up were strangely opened, and we just ran out. However, I did see a gentleman or a lady on the roof. He wore black armor, a crown-like helmet, and a cape. He just stood there watching us quietly. None of those bad guys came to stop us or chase us down. As a tutor at the free school, Daisy clearly had a richer set of vocabulary than her mother, Liv. A person dressed like that saved you, Liv answered in shock. By the side, Frasier curiously waited for the answer. Daisy nodded seriously and said, Yes, he's like what the bards sing of. A hero. Hero, Frasier ruminated over the word, her eyes as bright as the stars. In a certain secret chamber, a group of people were carefully comparing the Lanny Voss case with the Capheim case using the information they were given as they searched for similarities between the motives and modus operandi. The two things cannot be linked together at all. The only thing that they have in common is evil, or rather, evil was defeated. The owner of the tarot card has upheld justice, someone exclaimed. It can be confirmed that the two cases didn't involve the same person. The difference in strength is obvious, and what they're good at is even more contrasting. Although it's possible that their sequence had been elevated, Capheim's murderer was a kind of spectre, or someone that can switch into the sequence state. That's not something common. Another person's analysis was endorsed by the majority. Therefore, the person who called the meeting concluded, two cases, two different people, but they both threw out tarot cards. Perhaps the latter was committing a copycat crime, and if that's the case, we can target the people who are aware of the Lanny Voss case. The other possibility is that there is an organization. An organization symbolized by tarot cards, in Empress Borough, the opulent villa of Count Hall. The aroma of Fenner Potter's top-quality Mount St. Lucie coffee blended with the splendid fragrance of the Queen's black tea to create an intoxicating symphony of smells. They lingered around the elegant three-tiered high tea tray that served delicious and delicate desserts. This was the high tea party organized by Audrey. She had invited her friends of blue blood parentage, all who were fellow enthusiasts in mysticism. They sat around her, talking and laughing. Under Audrey's imperceptible guidance, Jane, Murray, and the others became extremely interested in the Dark Emperor, the hero bandit who had appeared last night. All of them cast their eyes towards the noble-born Kantia Sen who had joined MI9. What beyond the powers does that Dark Emperor have? The sweet-looking Christine asked curiously. Among the few of them, the lowest rank among their fathers was that of a Viscount. It allowed them to have sufficient status and channels to understand the existence of beyond the powers and potions in their endearing pursuit of mysticism. But just like Audrey before, they were all unwilling to join the Nitorks, the mandated punishers, the machinery hive mind, and MI9. Other than that, the families that they belonged to didn't have histories that traced back to 1,000 years ago. And even the ancient aristocrats that had just been established in the fourth epoch of the Loan Kingdom weren't completely loyal to the royal family or to the upper echelons of the military. They weren't bestowed with any formulas, and even if they had beyond their ingredients, it was unlikely that they could recognize them. They wouldn't even know how to use them even if they did recognize them. This limited the possibility of Murray, Christine, and the others in becoming beyonders. They could only look forward to it, but it was difficult for them to take that crucial step. As for whether or not their elders had collected the potion formulas and nurtured beyonders for their families, that was beyond their purview. After all, this wasn't allowed. If the king were to find out, they could use this as a reason to strip them of their noble titles. Of course, there were already 2 traitors in the living room, Audrey, who had advanced to sequence 8 telepathist, and Viscount Glaint, who had gathered one portion of beyonder ingredients. It wouldn't be long before he became an apothecary. The tall, thin, young gentleman, Gans, took a sip of his coffee and said, I won't give you a direct answer. I'll just tell you some facts. Other than traces of a gas explosion in the dining room where the battle happened, various means were used to detect poison, substitutes, spectres, shriek, bullets condensed with holy powers, and other elements. By the way, that Dark Emperor, no, hero bandit was in a spectre state. It doesn't look like the person who had killed Rear Admiral Hurricane Killang knows. Nor does it look like the person who had dealt with Lanivus in the sewers is the person involved in Capheim's case, Mr. Fool's third adorer who stole the Dark Emperor's card. There are at least 3 adorers in Back Underloam. How many adorers does he have in total? Audrey's heart skipped a beat as she deliberately asked, was there an intense beyond the battle? Murray, under her lead, asked one step further, there were beyonders at Capheim's place. Relatively powerful beyonders. And there was more than one. He's just a trafficker, Viscount Glaint unconsciously expressed his doubt. Audrey maintained her faint smile and curious gaze, patiently waiting for Kunz's reply. Kunz laughed and said, Murray's guess is correct. I can only say this much. Do you want me to be locked up by Captain? Capheim's place had more than one relatively powerful beyonder. Indeed, he's not an ordinary human trafficker. He might be involved in many matters regarding mysticism. Human trafficker, could he be involved in some cult's sacrificial rite? Mr. Fool's adorer attacked because of this. It was roughly the same with Lanivus. It involved a cult and sacrifices, as well as the descent of the true creator. I wonder which cult and evil god is behind Capheim. Mr. Fool's goal seems to have always been targeting these evil gods. Is it really strife between the gods? Who knows how many grand schemes of those evil gods he has foiled? Audrey made many connections as her heart surged with emotions. Our tarot club's enemies are the evil gods. The rest aren't qualified. Does Mr. Fool wish to get the title of the nemesis of evil gods? Audrey pursed her lips and chuckled softly in her heart. Then, she suppressed her emotions and secretly made a confession. Audrey, how can you do this? How can you use Mr. Fool as a joke? At noon, when Klein returned to Minsk Street, he found, as he had expected, a letter from old Koda, who had paid a carriage driver to deliver to his mailbox. This was their agreed-upon contact method during an emergency. Of course, according to Klein's prediction, old Koda, who didn't know many words, could only use simple symbols to tell him where and when they would meet. To his surprise, it was actually written in neat writing when he opened the letter. With a quick glance, Klein confirmed that it was identical to the handwriting in Daisy's vocabulary book. Looks like this girl was the one who helped old Koda write it. This piece of paper doesn't seem to be exposed to moisture. Perhaps old Koda had bought some in the event he needs to contact me urgently. Klein opened the door to the living room and read the letter. Only taking off his hat and cane, he leaned his cane against the wall. He didn't take off his coat because the fireplace in the room wasn't lit yet, and the early November cold was silently seeping into his bones. The letter was simple. After all, Daisy didn't know many words either. She thanked the detective for his kindness and good intentions before telling him that she safely returned home, and she finally said, in a tactful way, that she hoped he would bring her vocabulary book with him the next time he came to Eastborough. What a polite girl, Klein chuckled. He snapped his fingers and burned the letter, leaving no clues behind. He decided to return to Eastborough the next day and return the book to Daisy, as well as reimburse old Koda for the cost of the letter delivery, letters, paper, and fountain pens. With this in mind, he couldn't help but sigh and chortle. Captain, now it's my turn to approve the expense claims of others. Without wasting any time, he went out again and went straight to the Quiddiag Club, where Dr. Aaron was seen more often during Friday afternoons. Klein wanted to ask about Will or Septin, the child who had played with tarot cards. After entering the Quiddiag Club in Hillston Borough, Klein said to the red-vested attendant, a cup of Marquis black tea and a serving of dessert. Send it to the corner seat of the main hall. Dr. Aaron, reporter Mike, and the others are sitting there. Klein had already spotted the relatively cold and famous surgeon, Aronses, who was wearing gold-rimmed glasses, as well as reporter Mike Joseph from the Daily Observer, who he had worked with twice and had a pair of charming blue eyes. He also saw the aristocratic equestrian teacher, Talim Dumont, whose frequency of appearing at the club was only second to his. Oh, our great detective is here, and we happen to be talking about you. Talim stood up with a smile. Speaking bad things behind my back, Klein joked. Mike stood up and shook his hand. No, I want to hire you again. What's the matter this time? Klein bowed at Dr. Aaron and sat down at their table. Mike chuckled and said, I'm sure you've read the papers. Capheim has been killed off by the hero bandit Dark Emperor, and his crimes have been exposed. What a joyous event. And as a reporter, I need to have an acumen for the news. I plan to get a list of names of the girls who were rescued in Eastborough from the police department to interview them. Then, I'll paint Capheim's most cruel, most evil, and most unforgivable side to the readers of the newspaper. Of course, the victims must remain anonymous. He paused for a moment and suppressed his voice. I also have a hidden objective, or should I say, I wish to use the interview to know if these girls or their family know any relatively special friends. Who knows, that might be Hero Bandit Dark Emperor. You've found the right person. The corners of Klein's mouth almost twitched. He smiled at Mike and said, we've already worked together on East Borough's matters. We have sufficient familiarity and trust, so I have no reason to decline. I hope for a pleasant partnership. Mike stretched out his hand. We'll start tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, and we'll be paid the same as last time for a total of £10. At that moment, Dr. Aaron, who had been listening by the side, said, Sherlock, I want to hire you as well. This evening, or after dinner. It looks like my business is improving recently, Klein asked, amused. Will it conflict with Mike's request? No, Aaron shook his head. My luck recently has been pretty good. This makes me suspect that my bout of bad luck was because of that child's inverted Wheel of Fortune card and the words he said. I'm very troubled and puzzled in this regard. I swear to God that I was very nice to him, and I treated him with the best of intentions. Why would he treat me that way? I wished to visit him at his place and confirm that he didn't do it on purpose. However, I'm ultimately afraid that something similar would happen again or some accident might occur. Therefore, I wish to hire you to protect me. Just for tonight, it won't conflict with Mike's request. How about it? That's what I wanted to do. After challenging the impossible and doing good deeds, and my moral standing has become pretty good, am I really going to become the king of yellow and black who wields good luck? Klein was pleasantly surprised as he said with a reserved smile, no problem, we can talk about the remuneration. City of Silver. Derek Berg once again examined the translucent worm with 12 circles, the remains of Eamon's avatar. He had originally wanted to ask Mr. Fool what this was exactly, but considering how he had already troubled this godlike figure once, he couldn't bring himself to ask as he abandoned this plan. Now, he planned on showing it at the next tarot gathering and asked Mr. Hanged Man, Miss Justice, and the rest. After hiding the worm, Derek suddenly thought of something. It was about time for the team that had gone with Shepherd Eldelavia to explore the half-destroyed temple of the fallen creator to return. It wasn't too far from the City of Silver, and it was in a direction that they hadn't set foot in before. He decided to take a look. There were quite a few people he knew among the expedition team. Looking at the dark sky being lit up by streaks of lightning, Derek didn't knock on the doors of the few acquaintances he knew. Instead, he walked along the broadest road and walked all the way to the training field at the edge of the City of Silver. After each exploration team returned, they were forced to stay here for a certain period of time. Not only would it be convenient for them to communicate and report on the things they encountered in the darkness, but they would also be quarantined in a tactful manner to guard against strange things that might latch onto any member's body and suddenly erupt after a certain amount of time. This was the result of the City of Silver's 2,000 years of experience. It wasn't that complicated, but it was quite useful. As soon as he entered the training ground with the axe of Hurricane stuffed behind his waist, Derek Berg's eyes suddenly lit up. He saw the gorgeous Eldelavia, who seemed to be in her 30s, as well as two familiar faces that were his age. Due to the City of Silver's limited environment, its population was unable to grow any further. The number of people of a certain age group was an adequate number, and although Derek wouldn't dare say he knew all of them, he had seen a majority of them before. He was classmates and partners with some of them during general education classes and on the practice grounds. The person Derek was most familiar with on this expedition team was Dark Regents, who had once been his patrol teammate. The youngster named Dark was of medium height and was slightly chubby. He was strong, optimistic, and cheerful. His face often beamed with a friendly smile. Currently, he was a Sequence 8 gladiator of the Giant Pathway. At this moment, the two parties were separated by a translucent wall that was as hard as steel, making it impossible for them to make any effective form of contact. They had to wait until the members of the exploration team were confirmed to have no problems before they could meet directly. Derek, who had become silent and withdrawn since the death of his parents, waved to Dark. Noticing this, the gladiator turned his head to the side and looked over. Dark, how was it? You didn't encounter any danger, did you? Derek shouted. The material used to create the black wall in that area came from somewhere that wasn't far from the City of Silver and was called Dark Amber. It was hard as steel, but at the same time, it possessed a certain degree of transparency and had properties that made it good for transmitting sound. Derek's speech went through unobstructed. Derek imagined that Dark would definitely smile brightly and wave his arms out of habit, saying, "Take a look, I'm not injured at all, so shouldn't it be obvious that we didn't meet with any danger?" It was nothing. Hearing his voice, Dark walked a few steps closer to the wall and answered with a smile, "No, everything went smoothly." Looking at his smile without any faults, Derek suddenly felt a chill run through his body. It was just like he was camping in a ruined tower or a ruined city at night. Darkness was all around him as they accumulated into overwhelming horror. Inside the Quadiag Club, Klein and Dr. Aaron agreed on the remuneration, £2. I have to say that a doctor's money sure is easy to earn if it were me in the past. Such a request would have cost at most 10 solid. Klein, who already had the intention to take the mission, sighed in his heart. He remembered that during his time with the Nitorks, he had heard Corpse Collector mention that famous doctors had very high incomes. At the time, in a response that was unlike the poet, Leonard Mitchell, he said that as far as he knew, if a house was bought in a busy borough in Backland for a storefront, the quickest option would be to turn it into a clinic. They agreed to call on Will Septon's place after dinner. It wasn't 3 o'clock in the afternoon, so the equestrian teacher, Talim, gathered the three of them together at a table, and they began playing a game of Upgrade. The game which was invented by Emperor Acel. What I expected was to play tennis, practice shooting, flip through the books in the library, and live a healthy life, but why did it become like this? Klein spontaneously thought in between the card game. Frankly, with his current accomplishments in magic, he could have easily cleared out all the money Dr. Aaron, reporter Mike, and Talim had on them. But I'm an honest man, and I believe more in my skills and luck. As the red-vested attendant shuffled the cards, Klein picked up a cream cracker and took a savory bite. He couldn't help but marvel from the bottom of his heart, this is life. During the game, Klein noticed one thing. The equestrian teacher, Talim, was no longer in a daze or as upset as he was before. Has the matter of his friend falling in love with someone he shouldn't have been resolved? Klein thought curiously as he sipped the Marquis black tea. As a detective, he knew that this wasn't something he should ask in front of others, so he restrained himself and concentrated on his card game. By 5 o'clock, Mike Joseph had to go back to his company, so the game was suspended and Klein won 5 solly. My luck has been quite good recently. While Klein sighed with relief, he saw Dr. Aaron leave the table for the washroom. He controlled his voice and said with a low laugh, Talim, has your friend's problem been settled? Talim, who was throwing the cards and his hands onto the table, paused for a second before sighing with a smile. You could say so. He added with a certain desire to continue. Actually, it wasn't too serious. It was because I was thinking too much at the time. Simply put, it was an illustrious young gentleman who fell in love with a commoner. You should know that a man of such status as to marry a noble lady. Hey, to him, not even the daughter of a rich man can do. So that's how it is to think that I made up all sorts of contrived and bizarre stories, such as falling in love with a man, a monster, or a person that isn't permitted because of moral principles. Klein was disappointed and said with a laugh, as far as I know, gentlemen of high society don't mind having a mistress. No, Sherlock, you don't understand. Love, do you get it? Love, that young gentleman only wants to marry the commoner woman, Talim exclaimed with a sigh. No, I don't understand, I'm just a bachelor dog. Klein opened his mouth, unable to respond. Talim sighed to himself. For the sake of that young gentleman's future, I once thought of asking you to find people with some miraculous abilities to covetly. Hey, anyways, I'm a law-abiding citizen. So it was just an idea. How was the matter resolved afterward? Klein asked with interest. Talim picked up his Highlander coffee and took a sip. The solution was much simpler than I thought. I went straight to the lady and told her of the dilemma. She sensibly expressed her willingness to leave the gentleman and asked for my help. I must say that she's truly a considerate, kind, refined, and beautiful girl. If it wasn't for the consideration of my identity, perhaps I would have knelt in front of her and kissed the back of her hand. Well, it seems like I couldn't have helped. Klein picked up the golden-rimmed white porcelain cup of black tea. As a visitor from Earth, he was completely uninterested in the task of breaking up couples. However, listening to gossip was another matter altogether. After having dinner at the Quadiag Club and tasting the limited supply of Sonia lobsters, Klein and Dr. Aaron took the latter's carriage to Will Septon's house at 66 Dalton Street in North Borough. This was the address that Dr. Aaron had long since memorized. He didn't return to the hospital to look up the appropriate medical records, and according to Klein's conjecture, any relevant information pertaining to Will Septon would likely have been taken away by the Networks. As a former Network, I know exactly how they do things. Klein smiled bitterly and sighed. Pulling the doorbell, the two waited for a while before they saw the door open. A maid in a black and white dress puzzledly asked, Gentlemen, who are you looking for? Seeing that Aaron was still as cold as usual, Klein took the initiative to speak up. We're looking for Will Septon. This is his attending physician. He came back to check on his health. I don't know him. I've only been here for a few days. I'll get my master. Please wait a moment, the maid answered blankly. While they were waiting, Aaron suddenly said, I almost believe the reason you came up with just now. This is a basic quality of being a detective. Klein chuckled. At that moment, an old gentleman in his 50s walked to the door and said with a deep voice, Will Septon and his family have already moved away on. He gave a date. Aaron did a slight count before frowning. Why would they go through the trouble to move 2 days after being discharged from the hospital after the operation? He acted like he was really on a follow-up visit. Klein was slightly puzzled and asked, Sir, how do you know the date so clearly? Typically speaking, subsequent tenants would only move in after a certain period of time. The old gentleman snappily replied, Someone came to ask before, and I even went to look for the landlord just for that. Then Networks Klein asked without much hope, Do you know where Will Septon and his family moved to? No, the old man said tersely. Did they leave anything behind? Klein hesitated for a moment before continuing with his questions. Some stuff. The old man took a deep breath and continued, but they were all taken away by the previous group of people. Meeting colleagues truly is a helpless matter. They can always think of the things you think of ahead of time. Klein couldn't help but sigh. Seeing that there were no further clues, Klein and Aaron politely excused themselves and left 66 Dalton Street. It seems like you'll have to wait a long time before you can resolve your doubts. Klein turned to Dr. Aaron. Aaron was silent for a few seconds, then he slowly let out a breath. After what happened just now, I'm not so troubled anymore. I'm just a doctor, and it's good enough to mind my own affairs. I should return to do a follow-up checkup and not question the situation, what other people think, or why they're not kind. That shouldn't be something I should be concerned with. In the future, I should just try to maintain the relationship between the doctor and the patient as much as possible. It's for the best that you can think this way. Klein agreed from the bottom of his heart. Then he casually asked, at the time, what was wrong with Will Septon's left leg? His left calf grew a strange tumor that coincidentally formed a ring that pressed down heavily onto his blood vessels. Dr. Aaron recalled as he said, but the kid didn't look too upset. Just a little scared, and we wanted to preserve the leg at first, but it was getting worse. A Chinese phrase describing Sinkles. City of Silver. Derek Berg had no idea how he got home. All he remembered was the indescribable horror. Dark Regence's character and behavior didn't appear too different from his former self. However, it was true that there was a change to him that was unsettling. Derek was afraid that the City of Silver would be targeted by the evil god, the fallen creator. Afraid that the City of Silver would be obliterated before he could become the sun, saving it from its more than 2,000-year-long curse, and give hope and sunshine to the residents here. At that moment in time, he hated himself for not being strong enough, that he was still only at sequence 8. No, I can't just watch idly. Derek suddenly stood up, and he prepared to rush to the spire and tell the other elders of the six-member council and Chief Kalin Eliadov what he had discovered. However, Derek knew that such anomalies weren't suspicious. Every time they explored the depths of the darkness, the members would have a period of intense tension lasting for days, tens of days, or even more than a month. In addition, the uninhabited desolate plains and the hopeless journey would bring about extreme depression. In addition, in order to be safe, the members of the exploration team wouldn't be allowed to release any sexual urges that had been pent up during their excursions, which caused them to act differently after every exploration. If they ended up with more than half the team ending up dead or injured, a huge change in personality wasn't a rare occurrence. The manner of handling such people could only be dealt with via the usual quarantine and treatment with almost zero exceptions. The City of Silver had the first 3 sequences of the Dragon Pathway, so there was no lack of psychoanalysts. Derek rushed to the door and suddenly slowed down. He knew that this method of reporting to the six-member council might not be effective. It would likely arouse suspicion, and there might even be the threat of being targeted by the shepherd, Eldelavia. After pacing back and forth for more than 10 seconds, Derek gritted his teeth and pulled the door open. He felt that he had to warn the elders of the six-member council, even if it would be a huge risk for him. For the vast majority of the residents of the City of Silver, sacrificing their lives to maintain the existence of this city and the continuation of this civilization was the belief that was ingrained into their bones. Selfish people often didn't live long in such environments regardless of whether it was outside or inside. Of course, Derek wasn't completely reckless. Under the tutelage of the members of the Tarot Club, especially the Hanged Man, he clearly understood that there were times when one had to be patient, protect himself properly, and avoid unnecessary sacrifices in order to better defend the City of Silver. I'll only talk about the abnormality I observed. It shouldn't be dangerous, Derek consoled himself, running faster and faster. Finally, he saw the spire that represented the highest authority in the City of Silver. He found a Beyonder on duty and made a request to meet with the chief. To Derek's surprise, the Beyonder didn't ask the usual questions. After simply passing on the information, he was led up the stairs to the chief's room. Very strange, it's different from before. Derek felt that the changes in the details made him more uneasy. Entering the room, he saw Chief Kalin Eliad standing in front of the wall. This tall elder, with his deep blue eyes and messy white hair, had his back facing 2 swords that hung on the wall. He wore his usual flaxen-coloured shirt and brown coat, and it was hard to believe that he was an expert who had successfully hunted many devils and monsters. Derek Berg, what matter would actually require you to tell me at face-to-face? Kalin asked in a deep voice. Your Excellency, Derek saluted. I met the team that was sent to explore the temple at the training grounds today. I found that the dark regions I know has experienced a strange change. He's no longer as cheerful as he was before, and his smile is as polite as a stranger's. Also, Eldelavia doesn't frequently change the way she speaks like she usually did. Kalin looked deeply at Derek and asked in a low voice, just these 2 things? Yes, Derek lowered his head. I think there might be something unusual about that. Colin waved his hand and said, I got it, I'll get Ifla to do an investigation. You may return. In the future, you just need to report such matters to the Guardian of the Spire directly. Ifla was the City of Silver's most experienced psychoanalyst who was closest to Sequence 6. It was a pity that there was no potion formula after Sequence 7. After receiving such an answer, Derek left gloomily. Looking at Derek's bag as he disappeared by the door, Colin sighed in disappointment. After talking to Dr. Aaron about Will Septin's situation for a while, Klein got off the carriage and took the steam metro. After 3 stops, he arrived near Minsk Street and switched to a trackless public carriage to return home. As it was still early, he used divination to confirm that the previous tenant wasn't lying, and then he diligently continued to study the Book of Secrets. Ever since he had obtained this mysterious book, Klein's use of the mysterious space above the grey fog became more and more ingenious as he completed many more outstanding techniques. What limits me now is my own sequence, my own strength, and spirituality. Late at night, Klein hid the Book of Secrets and went to the bathroom to wash up, in preparation for bed. That night, he slept soundly. Even the church bells in the morning only made him turn over. Winter is the best time to stay in bed, Klein grunted and got up. To reward the hero bandit Dark Emperor, he had a sugared hard-boiled egg and strawberry jam he specially bought to match with white bread. Just as he was enjoying his meal, the doorbell suddenly rang. Didn't I tell Mike to come after breakfast? He took a sip of the sweet soup and wiped his mouth with a napkin. According to his agreement with reporter Mike, he would only arrive half an hour after breakfast before they began interviewing the rescued girls of East Borough. If Mike didn't appear after half an hour, then it meant that the matter would be delayed by a day. Klein walked to the door, but before he could reach out his hand, the outline of a visitor appeared in his mind. He wasn't reporter Mike Joseph but Dr. Aarons. Good morning, Aaron. Did you sleep late last night? Klein noticed that Aaron's face was pale, so he quietly activated his spirit vision to take a look. Aaron took off his hat and cane and started to take off his coat, but the cold air in the room stopped him. Klein laughed dryly and said, as you know, I'll be going out today. Mike might come looking for me, so I didn't light up the fireplace. Aaron nodded and didn't say anything else. He followed Klein into the living room, found a seat and sat down. Sherlock, I had a nightmare last night. I dreamed about that child, Will Septin. Nightmare? This is within the limits of my knowledge. I'm a professional when it comes to interpreting dreams, far more professional than deduction. Klein leaned forward, clasped his hands, and said, What kind of nightmare? Aaron recalled and said, There are some details and processes that I can't remember. What I remember most is a tall, pitch-black steeple with a huge silver snake coiled around it. It was moving slowly, looking at me with its cold, merciless red eyes. I don't know why, but I entered the steeple, and I would go up the stairs and, at other times, down the stairs, going through walls after walls, and one locked door after another. Finally, I found a child called Will Septin in a dark corner. He hopped a few steps on one leg and curled up against the wall, with tarot cards scattered everywhere beside him. When he saw me, he was scared and happy. He called out, "Dr. Aaron, the whole dream was roughly like that before I woke up." Klein listened attentively and thought for a while before asking, "Did Will Septon say anything else?" Aaron frowned in thought before suddenly saying, "Yes," he said, "Dr. Aaron, a snake wants to eat me." Following that, a giant silver snake hung down from the ceiling, its head facing me. Its mouth was very big, but it has no teeth, no tongue, and it was completely blood-red. "Silver giant snake of pitch black steeple Will Septon protected under layers of protection," Klein said to Dr. Aaron in a measured voice. "It's not a very strange dream. It likely has you subconsciously sensing some kind of predicament he was in while you were talking to Will Septon, that he was being threatened by something. That's why you dreamed of something like this, a child hiding in the depths of a tall steeple, behind countless walls and doors, huge silver snakes coiling around the top of the steeple. Hey, as a detective, we know a little bit of psychology. It's also often talked about in the newspapers. What I don't understand is why you didn't have such a dream until today." Klein didn't lie about his interpretation, but he didn't reveal the possible true reasons behind it. Aaron opened his mouth and said, "I was in too much of a hurry just now and forgot to mention something." As he spoke, he took out a leather wallet and took out a fairly exquisitely folded paper crane. After realizing that Will Septon and his family had moved away, I remembered that he had given me this before he left the hospital, saying, "Doctor, this will bring you good luck." I didn't pay much attention to it at the time and casually threw it into the office drawer. After parting with you last night, I went to retrieve it and put it in my wallet. As a result, I had a nightmare that very night. Klein looked at the paper crane, nodded thoughtfully and said, "Dr. Aaron, it looks like Will Septon didn't deliberately bring you bad luck. He had made up for it later. The paper crane invented by Emperor Cell is meant to act as symbolism for wishing you well. Besides, he said it would bring you good luck." Aaron subconsciously asked, "Origami was invented by Emperor Cell?" "I don't know if it's him, but I think it's likely him." Klein smiled. Probably. Aaron was relieved by Klein's explanation and reassurance, and he prepared to observe for a few more days to see if there were any more nightmares such as this. After sending the famous surgeon out of the door with a smile, Klein's expression suddenly became solemn, as if he was thinking about something. There was no problem with his interpretation of the dream. The pitch-black steeple, the walls and doors that blocked his path, and the giant silver snake. They all symbolized that Will Septon was in a situation where he was threatened by something that symbolized the child's fear and helplessness, as well as his attempts to hide behind layers of protection. But the problem was that this was unlikely to be a revelation Dr. Aaron's spirituality had received on its own. Otherwise, he wouldn't have had such a dream only until last night, or when he found the paper crane. A similar development should have taken place long before Will Septon was discharged, back when his spirituality unconsciously became aware of the particularly strange developments, allowing him to have similar experiences as he had now. Therefore, Klein suspected that the medium which instilled the dream into Dr. Aaron was the paper crane. Klein activated his spirit vision to carefully observe this handicraft, but he didn't find any spiritual brilliance. However, his spiritual perception and intuition told him that there was something strange about this piece of origami. Certain magical aspects that might involve the most illusory, most difficult to comprehend, and most worthy of fear and reverence, fate. That child called Will Septon isn't simple. It seems like the most amazing thing wasn't the tarot card, but rather he himself. The giant silver snake is a symbol of danger. And this matter is related to bad luck, good luck, and other elements. Could it be that it represents the snake of Mercury, sequence 1 of the monster pathway? Klein's thoughts wandered, but he couldn't be certain of anything. He turned to question the problem of how the dream was instilled. With Klein's accomplishments in mysticism, this wasn't something that was too complicated or difficult to understand. He quickly came up with an idea. The first thing to do was to rule out the influence of spectres and wraiths, which would have stained Dr. Aaron's aura with a blackish-green color of varying degrees. And I didn't see any sign of it just now. There are two main ways of instilling information without causing the owner of the dream to appear abnormal. One of them is using the beyond the powers of a nightmare like Captain. An objective is metro guidance, and it wouldn't involve the culprit. Otherwise, traces would similarly be left behind. The second method would be even more ingenious and advanced. The principle of a dreamland is that of astral projections traveling through the spirit world, and the details that one would normally unwittingly notice under external stimulation would turn into a symbolic revelation. Or they can obtain some enlightenment directly related to themselves from external sources. Then, their spirit bodies and psyche would be informed of this, and because the owner of the body was in a state of sleep, this will appear in the form of a dream. So the second way is to instill it into the spirit world. First, use some magical method to create the revelation that one will need, and then naturally let the target's astral projection obtain and feed back the information while roaming the spirit world. That way, the target will be able to dream of the scene that others would want them to dream of, and there will be no superficial traces. This is something that I'm currently unable to do, even if it's a spirit body that's able to partially wield some of the power above the grey fog. Klein paused for a moment and then added another possibility. A seed was planted in Dr. Aaron's subconscious through the paper crane, and once he found it, he would have the corresponding dream. That's easy to confirm. As long as I use mediumship on Dr. Aaron, I should be able to find traces of it. However, would it be unfriendly to use mediumship on him? Or should I borrow the mental terror candle from Father Yudravsky? No, the one who recognized me was that vampire, the zealous figure in lava, Emlyn White, not a muscular giant like Father Yudravsky. Klein reined in his thoughts and considered his subsequent actions. He decided that he would wait until he went above the grey fog to divine the level of danger. If it was an acceptable level, he would sneak into Dr. Aaron's house tonight, use the dream charm and other methods to secretly observe him, and see if the source of the dreamland was a result of direct guidance or an indirect fabrication. However, with Klein's strength and level, it would be difficult to find traces of the latter. Even he himself didn't have much confidence. This didn't mean that his astral projection could travel the same spirit world as Dr. Aaron's astral projection by sitting next to him and entering cogitation. This required a sufficient amount of locking on to do so. According to the descriptions in the Book of Secrets, the existence of the spirit world was quite magical. it completely overlapped with the real world, so everyone could obtain revelations from the spirit world at any time. However, the spirit world didn't distinguish between directions, and the past, present, or future could even intersect there. It was like infinite knowledge, information, and illusions were spiritually gathered and compressed into a strange sea. It was different from the world as one would imagine according to usual concepts or logic. As a result of this, the revelations that one received from the spirit world could only be a variety of symbols, not direct answers. And precisely because of this, every astral projection's experience of traveling in the spirit world was not only related to their physical location and time, but it was also dependent on the current state of their body and the mind. Without locking onto the corresponding location, it made it impossible to lock onto and find a person's astral projection in the spirit world, even if one was physically next to them. This was also the reason why the astral projection's movement in the spirit world was limited, and one doesn't dare to venture too deep. Once it got lost and was unable to return to its body, its owner would become a retard and, even more seriously, a vegetable. It was even more difficult to use the spirit world as a springboard for transference. If one wasn't careful, then they would lose their way and never be able to return to the real world until they rocked to death. Phew, Klein exhaled, temporarily throwing the question to the back of his mind. He took out his pocket watch and looked at the time. He realized that he had been thinking too long, that his breakfast had already turned completely cold, and that the fact that reporter Mike hadn't arrived yet meant that the commission was likely to be delayed by a day. In the spirit of not wasting anything, Klein finished the rest of his meal and then went above the grey fog to make a divination. He was surprised to find that there were no revelations indicating danger at all. After doing all of this, the appointed time had passed. Without any hesitation, he changed into a heavy jacket, put on his cap, grabbed the vocabulary book, and left 15 Minsk Street. His initial plan was to accompany Mike Joseph to Eastborough for an interview and find an opportunity to hint at old Kohler to not mention his promise of helping Live find her daughter. As for Live's family, he let old Kohler do the reminding. And now, after Mike had pushed back the interview by a day, Klein was even more at ease, no longer worried about any mishaps or mistakes. With the address mentioned by old Kohler, and according to the revelation from divination, Klein entered the depths of Eastborough, and under the watchful, wary, numb, or greedy gaze of the crowds, he found the room on the 3rd floor. There were 2 bunk beds here, and there were also some old and worn bedding on the floor. Every empty space was filled with sundries. Klein looked directly at the bottom bunk of the innermost bunk and called out, "Old Kohler." With a swoosh, old Kohler sat up and leaned towards the door in pleasant surprise. "You really came. After sending you that letter yesterday, I already guessed that you would come looking for me today, so I didn't go to the dock. I've been waiting at home all this time. Well, I don't have to think about how to fabricate the lie about why I came straight here to find you." Klein looked around and said, "Old Kohler, with your current income, you can definitely rent a better room and move to a better place. Why did you only change your bed from the floor to a bunk bed? Most of the money is for gathering information for you." Old Kohler laughed. "And I'm no longer young. I need to save some money for the future when my future health wanes." Klein was silent for 2 seconds before saying, "You can consider buying some insurance, such as a single elder aid policy. They can give you the money that can at least fill your stomach and a room for you to sleep in every week when you're really old." The insurance industry of this world had sprouted in the 4th epoch. After being promoted by Emperor Cell, it had matured quite a bit. There were various kinds of insurance, such as the various insurances for maritime trade, fire insurance, injury insurance, long-term care insurance in different names, and so on. They were mostly targeted at the rich and the middle class. I know, when I was a worker, I paid a premium of 3 pence a week, but after I lost my income, old Kohler sighed. His biggest problem now was that his income was unstable, and he wondered when the money he received from the detective would be cut off. Klein couldn't promise anything either. He pointed outside and said, "Let's go to Live's house," and returned the vocabulary book to the girl. After leaving the room, Klein casually mentioned, "What a joke. I was talking about doing volunteer work the day before yesterday and volunteered to help find Daisy, but she ended up being sent back by the police yesterday. Please don't mention it again, I don't want to be laughed at." "All right," old Kohler agreed first, then he said, "No one will laugh at your kindness." After walking through the dirty streets, they arrived at Live's house. Klein saw that the girl who had just been rescued had started ironing again, and he saw that the clothes here were hanging down and dripping with water. It was just as it was before. He was momentarily at a loss as to what to say. "Daisy, after a while," he said, "your vocabulary book." Daisy's eyes lit up, but she was too busy to leave. After busying herself for quite a while, she stopped working and went to the door, thanking him profusely. After Live and Fraser had also put down their work and come over to express their gratitude, Klein repeated what he had just said to old Kohler. After receiving positive responses, he took out the £2 worth of change that he had prepared and handed it to Live. "There will be a reporter coming to interview Daisy tomorrow. This is the advance of the payment he's giving, but don't mention it in front of him, otherwise things will become complicated. Hey, maybe he will give more tomorrow, but not that much. No, I'm willing to expose that bad guy's evil deeds. I don't want money." Daisy shook her head. Klein let out a soft chuckle. "This is a rule. You can't break rules, understand?" He looked at Live and said, "Take it. Your belief is right. It's only if Daisy and Fraser learn more words and learn more things will you all escape from this situation." He was going to suggest that Live's family should move to the edge of Eastborough. Customers who could afford to hire others to do their laundry wouldn't live in Eastborough, but in the end, he didn't mention it. He had intended to provide them with more help, but he restrained himself. There were thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of people like Live and her family in Eastborough. Even if one was a wealthy banker who wanted to help them, they wouldn't be able to make a splash. Besides, this was just Eastborough. There was still the entire back London, the Lower Kingdom. "Thank you, and help me thank the reporter for me." Live was silent for a moment, then she took the money. Klein didn't stay for long. He quickly left as if there was a ghost that would devour his soul. After walking outside with old Koda, he turned around and suddenly sighed. He said in a low voice, "There has never been a savior." "What?" old Koda asked, not hearing him clearly. Klein looked at the potholed road in front of him and said in a self-deprecating manner, "Nothing. I hope Live's family can get out of this situation and live in better conditions." He had indeed voiced out his thoughts. Being one of the inheritors of the Foodaholic Empire's new era, it was perfectly normal for him to think of a revolution, to mobilize the masses, and to change the world. However, when he thought about the details, he felt that he couldn't save himself just by relying on the poor. This was because beyond the forces existed in this world. Furthermore, they were relatively supernatural and couldn't be resolved simply by firearms. For instance, Sequence 5 of the Mutant Pathway. That was just one aspect of things. Another aspect of things was due to the law of beyond the characteristics conservation. Due to the limited access to ingredients, beyond the forces couldn't become commonplace, making it difficult to convert the advantage of numbers into effective combat power. And even if it could be spread, as long as the problem of losing control wasn't resolved, then it would still bring about disaster. If there weren't any high sequence beyond theirs, then there would actually be ways to deal with all of this to a certain extent. However, in the real world, not only were there demigods, but there were also sealed artifacts that could kill people without them even knowing how they died. Besides, deities were real and they stood high and lofty. In this way, the poor would use strikes and street protests to fight back. However, once they took up weapons and established an army, they would be met with an unstoppable counterattack. It wasn't impossible for a large-scale natural disaster to occur, one that would affect people psychologically. The only ones that were on par with the official Beyonder organizations were mostly secret organizations. Typically, they were related to evil forces, so by joining hands with them, death might not even be the most tragic ending. Therefore, to embark on the path of revolution, the most hopeful road to success was to get the support of one or more churches. How many concessions could be obtained through simple strikes and street protests while still meeting the vested interests of those involved? Bribery would be much easier, however. The incident regarding the true creator, who almost made use of the miserable situations of the poor to descend upon Backland, has seemed to stir the Church of the Evernight Goddess and the nobles who were aware of the situation. I can see that from the investigation mission that Mike had accepted and the information provided by Miss Justice, Klein's thoughts lingered on East Borough, the dock area, and the factory district. In the end, he couldn't help but let out a laugh and sigh in his heart. After all the ideas that come to me, it seems that only through the threat of an evil god's descent can the poor's situation be improved. However, the evil gods are also the ones who can't wait to draw on their flesh and blood, existences that devour their souls. They're the ones most likely to bring a disaster that no one can escape from. What wonderful irony. In Empress Borough, the opulent villa of Count Hall. As Dr. Escalante had upcoming masses she had to attend to, Audrey had brought forward her second psychology lesson for the week. Susie, more excited than she was, had long rushed into the study, even leaving the ball game she usually loved the most aside. Audrey purposely displayed her curiosity during this lesson, occasionally asking Escalante about psychology related to mysticism. At the end of the lesson, Escalante finally spoke after some deliberation. "Miss Audrey, we've organized a seminar on this subject. Many members have specialized in the intersecting field of psychology and mysticism. Are you interested in joining?" "Of course," Audrey nodded and answered without the slightest sign of hesitation. It perfectly matched her predetermined innocent and curious personality that she had set for herself. Escalante smiled. "Remember to keep this a secret. You know that your elders have a strong prejudice against the study of mysticism. I'll bring you there for the next lesson." "No problem." Audrey gave her consent with a hint of excitement. After sending off Escalante, whose hair reached her waist, out the study, she closed the door behind her, faced the mirror by the bookcase, and remained silent for 2 seconds. Following that, she lifted up her skirt and took a step and did a swirl from a court dance. Then, looking at herself in the mirror, she sweetly smiled and said, "Audrey, you're great." Audrey knew that she had taken the first step in entering the Psychology Alchemists. Although the seminar was most likely an outer circle, and there would definitely be a lot of tests to follow, this really made her open the door to the Psychology Alchemists. In the process, she didn't borrow strength from the outside world, but instead, she relied solely on her observation and performance to perfectly hide it from psychiatrist Dr. Escalante. Therefore, she was very proud of herself. "That seminar sounds interesting." Susie leaned over and wagged her tail. "Audrey, can I join?" "Join?" Looking at this golden retriever with its wicked round eyes, Audrey immediately sank into deep thought. She dragged out a terse acknowledgement. "I can't do it at the moment, Susie. Are you too conspicuous?" At this point, she changed the topic of the conversation and said with a slight smile, "But I can bring you along." On Saturday night, taking his master key and his black cane, Klein walked out at 15 Minsk Street. Without the latter, he didn't think that he would be able to return today. He was going to find Dr. Aaron, enter his dream, and find out how the nightmare regarding Will Orsetting came about. As for where Dr. Aaron lived, he had already found out yesterday, 3 Birmingham Road, Hillston Borough. By the time Klein arrived, it was past 11 o'clock and the neighborhood was dark and silent. After tossing a coin and performing a divination, Klein passed through the outer bars, walked around to the side, and used the master key to open up an invisible passage through the wall into the dark corridor. With his agile steps, he quietly went up to the 2nd floor and hid in an empty guest room. When it was clear that Dr. Aaron and his wife were asleep, Klein entered their bedroom through the wall. The first thing he did was take out a slumber charm and mutter the incantation, making Dr. Aaron's wife really fall asleep, preventing her from suddenly waking up and disturb what he would subsequently do to her husband. Then, Klein sat down on a chair in front of the dresser, held the dream charm in his hand, and whispered a word in ancient Hermes, crimson. As soon as he finished saying that, he felt the charm in his palm become light, as though it had become a weightless illusion. As his spirituality poured in, a transparent flame wrapped around the charm, burning a deep and serene black. Driven by Klein's will, the blackness spread out, enveloping both Dr. Aaron and himself. Klein quickly entered a cogitation state and saw the endless darkness and the single oval-shaped light. His spirituality extended out and touched that illusory and hazy object. The world around him suddenly turned upside down and twisted, and Klein found himself on a barren plain, with pitch-black stones at his feet and not even a blade of grass. In the center of the plain stood a black steeple with a huge silver snake coiled around it. It had its head reared up, and its red eyes stared coldly in their direction. Unlike what Dr. Aaron had described, the silver serpent had no physical scales, and its body was covered in dense patterns and symbols. They were all connected to each other into what seemed like wheels, and there were different symbols around each wheel. The giant snake's tail and head's wheels were each halved, looking incongruous, as though they could kill a person with obsessive-compulsive disorder. But Klein imagined that if the giant silver snake could bite its own tail with its mouth, the wheel would be complete. It wouldn't be disconnected, and there wouldn't be any more changes. Next to Klein, Dr. Aaron stared blankly ahead, moving closer and closer to the dark steeple. I can now confirm that no one is guiding Dr. Aaron that excludes Nightmare Beyond the powers. Klein quickly made a judgment. He didn't stop Dr. Aaron, but he followed him towards the black steeple and the silver snake. The two of them had only taken a few steps when their target had already appeared before them. The giant silver snake had its upper body bent down, as though it was considering how to enjoy the dessert that was delivered to its mouth. Its mouth opened wide, but there was no putrid smell coming from it. Its red eyes were cold and merciless, looking at everything like they were nothing more than prey, yet it didn't have the slightest hint of bloodlust or cruelty. In front of it, everything seemed puny and equal because of their insignificance. In the end, the serpent didn't launch an attack. Klein followed Dr. Aaron through an old, rotting wooden door and into the darkness of the tower. As Aaron had told him, the layout was abnormally confusing and chaotic. The stairs spiraled up and down, and the halls, libraries, and rooms were normal, inverted, and some were embedded in other parts. It was a building that couldn't possibly exist in the real world. After passing through the doors and walls, Klein had no idea where he was in the Black Tower. Perhaps he had reached the top or perhaps the basement. In the rich darkness, he suddenly noticed a figure curled up in the corner in front of him. The figure, sensing Dr. Aaron's approach, scrambled to its feet, hopping over on one leg. It was only when the figure was very close did Klein clearly see him. He looked dignified and strong, in his early teens, and had an expression of obvious fear. The figure was about 1.4 meters tall, and his left calf was missing. It was obvious that he was the child who had undergone surgery, Willow Septin. In his hand was a deck of tarot cards. His pitch-black eyes were filled with surprise and joy, as well as fear and horror. Dr. Aaron, a snake wants to eat me. Suddenly, he let out a blood-curdling scream as the image of a huge, mysterious silver snake was reflected in his eyes. Whoosh! The tarot cards in his hand fell to the ground, leaving only one card tightly gripped in his palm. Klein focused his gaze over it and saw that there was, similarly, a wheel on the card. It was the Wheel of Fortune card. Whoosh! The dream shattered instantly, and Klein found himself still sitting in a chair in front of the dresser. The crimson moon outside the window was obscured by the clouds, its moonlight that penetrated through the curtain barely outlined the large objects in the bedroom. The darkness and intensity became the main theme of the room. Klein sat in such an environment and was in no hurry to leave. He looked at the sleeping Dr. Aaron and began to analyze the images he had seen in the dream. Will Septin eventually held the Wheel of Fortune card in his hand. And in such a dream, everything symbolizes something. It's a revelation obtained by one's astral projection. In other words, Will Septin's matter is related to fate. Furthermore, that giant silver snake might very well represent the snake of Mercury. This child might actually be related to a high sequence beyonder, be of the monster pathway, or some strange sealed artifact. Does his danger stem from the snake of Mercury, or the result of greed due to the strange sealed artifact? But the snake of Mercury is sequence 1. It's an existence closest to the god. Just its name on its own is an embodiment of his high level. It's impossible that he can't do anything to a child like Will Septin. That Aemon, who is of an unknown sequence number, perhaps sequence 1, 2, or 3, could even invade the space above the grey fog with just an avatar. This matter doesn't seem to be that simple. There must be a huge secret behind his matter. At this thought, Klein had already decided to pull back completely. It's obviously a very dangerous matter. Furthermore, the tarot card might not be a mystical item. What's special might very well be Will Septin himself. Yes, apart from having nightmares, Dr. Aaron's troubles are already settled. There's no reason for me to get involved in it. To proactively act on this and challenge the impossible is nearly identical to suicide. Yes, I must follow what my heart tells me. Klein pushed the surface of the dressing table with his black gloved right hand and slowly stood up. Having just entered the dream, he was completely convinced that Dr. Aaron's nightmare came from a revelation that his astral projection had received in the spirit world. And that revelation had been deliberately created and provided by a high-level existence. The paper crane was just a tool for locating him. According to a chapter in the Book of Secrets, Klein could also try to use the paper crane to find Dr. Aaron's astral projection in the spirit world and observe the source of the revelation. But he had already decided to not get involved. Stretching his body, Klein flipped through Dr. Aaron's leather wallet with the last of his curiosity, and he took out the paper crane. He placed the paper crane on the tip of his cane, and he held them simultaneously. Then, his eyes turned deep as he softly muttered to himself, Will Septin's current location. After the divination sentence was repeated 7 times, a breeze suddenly blew in the room, bringing with it a cool feeling as if it were blowing on one's soul. Klein let go of his right palm, and the cane stood firm before falling down with the paper cranes, pointing diagonally at the bed. There, Klein frowned and moved to another position. He repeated the divination and successfully received his feedback. And the intersection point of the two divinations was Dr. Aaron. Will Septin's position overlaps with that of Dr. Aaron. That's interesting, Klein said to himself, amused and amazed. His curiosity was piqued to the extreme. Although he didn't intend to get involved in this matter, he wanted to know why there was an overlapping situation such as this. Why don't I bring the paper crane above the grey fog for divination? With the grey fog's obstruction, there won't be any accidents. Klein quickly came up with a new idea. Since it wasn't convenient for him to summon himself in Dr. Aaron's bedroom, he decided to take the paper crane home first. He had actually long prepared for this. Before coming, Klein couldn't confirm the seriousness of the matter, and he had hoped to find Will Septin, seeing if he had the opportunity to obtain the tarot card. Therefore, he had prepared another paper crane to replace the real one. It made it easier for him to do all sorts of divination, and he could switch it back once the problem was resolved. As soon as he thought of it, Klein took out the paper crane he had prepared. He had deliberately folded it above the grey fog, just in case Dr. Aaron had suddenly decided to hand over anything related to Will Septin to the Church of the Evernight Goddess, allowing his counterfeit to be divined. Taking into account the overall picture and the details would make things much easier, Klein praised himself. With the help of the faint moonlight, he carefully compared Will Septin's paper crane and his, to see if there were any clear differences. Upon comparing them, Klein immediately fell silent. His handicraft skills weren't even comparable to a child's. In fact, they're all paper cranes, so there isn't much of a difference. Mine is only a little cruder. As long as Aaron hadn't studied the original one carefully, then he wouldn't be able to tell that it has been swapped. Klein muttered silently to himself, took out a coin, and used divination to make a final confirmation. After receiving a revelation that confirmed this, he put his paper crane back into Aaron's wallet and returned it to its original position. He then took care of the scene, bringing Will Septin's paper crane along with him and left 3 Birmingham Road. With the help of the dowsing rod, Klein successfully returned home. While he was taking a bath, he summoned himself and brought the paper crane along with the master key above the grey fog. Sitting in the quiet and empty palace hall, he picked up the paper crane and carefully examined it for a few seconds, but he didn't discover anything abnormal. Then, with a pen and paper, Klein wrote the same divination sentence as before, Will Septin's current location. This time, he switched to using dream divination, and he was pleasantly surprised to see an image appear in the world of the grey fog. It was a dark room. A strong and dignified Will Septin leaned against the desk with the help of a chair by the window, and he looked out at the scenery with his pitch-black eyes. He held a stack of tarot cards in each hand, and beside them, there was a pile of wooden blocks. The wooden blocks formed a ring-shaped snake that connected itself from head to tail. The scene outside the window was just as dark, and there was the faint sound of flowing water. The dream ended here without a sound. Klein opened his eyes, tapped the edge of the long bronze table with his finger, and he said to himself, that Ouroboros-like snake is indeed the snake of Mercury. That means it's the snake of Mercury which represents fate. There was the sound of running water outside the window. Does that mean that Will Septin's current position is close to the Tussock River? Previously, when I divined his position, was the overlap with Dr. Aaron caused due to interference by fate? Seeing that divination above the grey fog could only receive a revelation of this degree, Klein was no longer troubled by curiosity. He barely interpreted the situation and planned to exchange the paper crane tomorrow night. He would then find an opportunity to guide Dr. Aaron and have him go to the Church of the Evernight Goddess to tell the bishop about this matter. It's best to leave such matters to the officials. Klein let out a chuckle and returned to the real world. After taking a leisurely bath, he didn't get busy and crawled into bed. After an unknown period of time, Klein suddenly realized that he was clearly dreaming. He was in the living room, reading the Book of Secrets. This familiar feeling, he turned his head to look at the door like he usually did. The door creaked open, and a figure in a grey coat walked in. He was about 30 years old, with a long, thin face with a broad forehead, and dark blue eyes that looked intelligent. It's not the captain. Klein suddenly gave a self-deprecating laugh, let out a silent breath, and turned the Book of Secrets in his hand into a copy of Ladies' Aesthetic. He flipped through the magazine, casually greeting the newcomer. The man in the grey coat took off his hat and sat down across him, seemingly casually asking him, Aaron came to see you this morning? It really isn't a talk, a nightmare. Klein resisted the urge to sigh and replied with a smile, yes. He had already figured out why when a talk had suddenly entered his dream. The nightmare in front of him was likely the captain of the Talk's team responsible for the matter regarding Will Septin, but they had yet to find any useful clues up to date. In this case, Dr. Aaron and Detective Sherlock Moriarty's act of visiting to ask about Will Septin's whereabouts must have been made known to them last night or this morning. At the same time, they discovered that Dr. Aaron rushed over to Minsk Street, shortly after he finished his breakfast, to visit Detective Sherlock Moriarty. In the spirit of professionalism, entering a person's dream at night was the most natural and normal development. As for Dr. Aaron, his situation was rather sensitive, so rashly entering a dream might cut off clues, so there was no doubt that a certain detective became the first choice. What did he encounter? The captain of the Talk's team asked casually. Klein answered honestly, he had a nightmare. Klein described the pitch-black tower, the giant silver snake, and Will Septin under layers of protection, and other scenes. Finally, he said, before this nightmare, Aaron had gone to Will Septin's place to find the child. Partially because he was worried about his health, but also because he was puzzled over his bad luck. Unfortunately, the Septin family had moved away. However, Aaron recalled that the boy had given him a paper crane that the boy had folded himself and had wished him luck. Perhaps agitated by these two events, he had such a nightmare. The man in the grey coat looked pleasantly surprised. Paper crane? Yes, Klein nodded slightly. The child gave it to Aaron before he was discharged, and Aaron threw it into his office drawer. He forgot about it until last night. I understand. Thank you for your explanation. The captain of the Talk's team stood up and bowed with his hand against his chest in a very polite manner. Suddenly, there was a ripple in the dreamland, and he disappeared from the room. Looking at the position where he had sat, Klein deduced what would happen next. The Talks might go to Dr. Aaron's tonight and enter his dream for investigations and take the paper crane away. However, a question arose. The paper crane was folded by Klein, and the real thing was above the grey fog. Forget it. Regardless of which paper crane they use, they'll never be able to divine the answer. It doesn't matter if I switch it back or not, Klein said to himself. He gathered his thoughts and continued to sit there. He wasn't in a hurry to leave the dreamland, and he stared blankly for a long time. After a while, the corners of his mouth curled up as he softly sighed. How nostalgic. On Sunday morning, shortly after Klein finished his breakfast, he heard the doorbell ring as he had expected. But to his surprise, it wasn't just reporter Mike Joseph. Dr. Aaron was with him as well. Sherlock, I had that nightmare again last night. I don't think it's normal. Aaron didn't keep matters a secret even with Mike around, revealing it the moment he entered the living room. Without waiting for Klein's reply, he took out his wallet and took out a paper crane. Do you think this is the problem? Ever since I found it and started to carry it with me, I've been having nightmares. Klein nonchalantly glanced at it when his expression froze suddenly. If he hadn't been a clown in the past and had great control over his facial muscles, then he might have revealed an undisguised smile in front of the reporter and doctor. Yes, a smile. This paper crane is even uglier than the one I made. This was the first thought that came to Klein's mind. At that moment, he had the urge to cover his face and sigh. Could having poor handicraft skills be a tradition of the Nighthawks? There was no doubt that the paper crane in front of him was the result of another switch. After receiving accurate information from Klein, the Nighthawks had seemingly sneaked into Dr. Aaron's bedroom without any delay and switched their folded paper crane for the one in his wallet. But what they didn't expect was that the one in the wallet was also a fake. It was folded by Klein above the grey fog and appeared rather crude. I feel an inexplicable sense of joy. Klein glanced at Dr. Aaron, who didn't notice it, cleared his throat, and said, perhaps. I suggest that you go to the cathedral again and talk to the bishop you previously talked to. We need to believe that the gods that we believe in are always watching over us. As he spoke, he drew a triangular sacred emblem on his chest. After the nightmare had left last night, Klein had specifically gone above the grey fog to divine if it was dangerous having switched the paper crane. The result was that it was very safe. Thus, he was now able to make this suggestion with great interest, in an attempt to tease his former colleagues. I wonder how they would feel seeing the paper crane that they didn't fold very well returned to them. Klein placated Dr. Aaron in all seriousness and turned to the reporter and said with a smile, Mike. To tell the truth, what I really want to advise Aaron to do is to go see a psychiatrist, but faith can certainly soothe his soul. You're not being frank at all, Mike laughed. All right, let's go. The next day, Klein accompanied the Daily Observer reporter into Eastborough to interview the rescued girls. With a full pounder's payment for the interview, no one refused it, not even some of the abused girls. In this interview, Capheim's sin was the main focus. The current situation of the girls was another main focus. The former made people angry, while the latter left people feeling heavy. Daisy was actually lucky enough to be able to return to work when she got home and use her labor to barter for food. Less than a third of those who were rescued were like her, and most of them were the kinds with some savings at home. And they were in a position that allowed the traumatized women to heal and have time before they sought out suitable jobs. As for the other two-thirds of those rescued, they had to continue working hard in order to survive. And in the face of the mass unemployment of textile workers, they were often only able to find temporary jobs with low wages. Those with parents and siblings who hadn't lost their jobs were still okay. At least, they were able to help each other, barely filling their stomachs. The families in less optimistic situations had already begun to walk the path of street girls, as though they had never been rescued. The act of betraying their bodies once was perhaps only for some food. This caused Mike to turn silent like before, and it was only when it was dark and once he left Eastborough before his spirit returned. He thanked Klein. Sherlock, it's all thanks to you. Otherwise, I definitely would have been blackmailed today by those rogue gangsters. Isn't that why you hired me? Klein smiled politely without any complacency. With Old Kohler informing them beforehand, Old Kohler and Live's family hadn't revealed that he had helped search for Daisy for free. Especially when Daisy, who was pretty smart, was asked if she knew any relatively special people, she answered directly, Mr. Reporter and Mr. Detective. Mike nodded sluggishly and walked on in silence for a long time. Before he boarded the carriage, he suddenly let out a sigh. I would like to make a call in this report for the government to use Capheim's estate to set up a bursary fund, which will use the annual income to help the rescued girls and others who have been harmed by Capheim to get them out of their predicament. Although Capheim's safe had already been robbed clean by the hero bandit, his greatest wealth is the property he bought. These should have all been obtained illegally. Klein listened carefully, gave Mike a deep look, and said in sincere praise, You're the best reporter I've ever met. There are plenty of reporters like me. They are always idealists in the world, Mike sighed. With that, he paid £10 to Klein and took off his hat and waved it. As he watched the reporter get into the rental carriage, Klein was about to take a public carriage in the other direction when Mike suddenly opened the window and asked with a gibing smile, Sherlock. I'm not the only reporter you know, am I? Klein was stunned for a moment, then he laughed. Yes. City of Silver. Like a trapped beast, Derek Berg paced around the room in anxiety. He felt that the chief wasn't paying enough attention to his report. He was worried that the exploration team members, who had been affected by the fallen creator to an unknown extent, would cause devastating damage to this city that had lasted for 582 years in the darkness after their quarantine. In such a situation, he was eager to obtain advice from Mr. Hangman, Miss Justice, and company, who were rather familiar with the fallen creator. This was the tarot gathering he anticipated the most. Wait a little while longer, just wait a little longer. If Mr. Fool doesn't summon me, I will pray directly to him. Derek tried to calm himself down, but his pacing didn't slow down one bit. Suddenly, he saw the endless grey fog and heard the messianic voice say, Prepare for the gathering. With a sigh of relief, Derek sat down on the edge of the bed carefully and lay down, pretending to be ready to sleep due to exhaustion. After silently counting 1,000 rapid heartbeats, he waited for a while before he was engulfed by the illusory dark red light. At that moment, Derek's room was abnormally quiet. Lightning streaked across the sky outside his window, keeping the darkness away from the land. Suddenly, by the corner of his bed, a black figure squirmed and extended, taking the shape of a human. The dark figure quickly grew tall and quietly looked down at Derek. He carefully observed him for nearly a minute, then withdrew without gleaning anything. In the corner, the shadows remained the same, unchanging. The endless grey fog lingered beneath his feet as usual. The long bronze table in front of him was mottled with green rust, but it didn't seem to be rotten at all. The first things that Derek saw were Miss Justice and Miss Magician sitting opposite him. The familiar, jovial greeting sounded in his ear. "Good afternoon, Mr. Fool." "Good afternoon." Klein, shrouded in grey fog, nodded slightly. He seemed to respond leisurely to Miss Justice and the other members' greetings, but in reality, he was busy manipulating the world, making him appear like a real person. After yesterday's interviews with reporter Mike, it was already dinner time. Klein went to a restaurant that served Venepotter cuisine, and he was so overwhelmed by the spiciness that he voluntarily ordered a cup of desert beer. After eating his fill and returning home, he didn't go out again for the rest of the day. Neither did he study the Book of Secrets or prepare his own food. That eased the heavy emotions he felt whenever he went to Eastborough. Without realizing it, the afternoon had arrived, and his thoughts shifted to the tarot gathering. After the greetings, Justice, Audrey, restrained her curiosity and excitement, and she was in no hurry to inquire about the truth behind the Capheim incident. Mr. Fool might not answer, but how would I know if he wishes to answer if I don't ask? Well, I hope he makes a request of equal value, and I'll do my best to fulfill it. Audrey looked around at the other members and observed the states of the other members. As a telepathist, she very quickly discovered something strange. A. The son appears very anxious. Did something happen to the previous exploration team captain? Did he encounter Amon? In addition, Force is in an indecisive state of wanting to ask but not daring to. She must have seen the papers and guessed from the tarot cards that our tarot club was involved in Capheim's death. But she's curious who the Emperor card represents. She seems to be even more in awe of Mr. Fool. What happened? Mr. Hanged Man seems to be in a very good mood. He's finished digesting his potion. He seems to be anticipating something. Mr. World is still as gloomy and reserved as before, and it's hard to read his thoughts. He really is the nemesis of the spectator pathway. Derek didn't try to hide his anxiety, but he didn't consult the other tarot club members directly. He knew perfectly well that the initial time belonged to Mr. Fool, unless there were no so-called Russell diary entries. There's no need to rush. The gathering has already begun. If Mr. Fool is in a good mood, he might be able to answer some questions. Derek consoled himself. Alger looked up and humbly said, "Honorable Mr. Fool, I've found 3 new pages of Russell's diary." "Diary? Russell's diary?" Force pricked up her ears. Klein smiled and replied, "What do you want to exchange them for?" Glancing at the card next to Mr. Fool's hand, Alger suppressed his eagerness and said, "I want to know what that card you have next to you is."